So after we press the pallet, dry pressing or semi-dry pressing, and we would reach certain density. But after you press, you have to so-called release it from your die, your mold, right? That's the thing. And what people find is a phenomenon called spring back or strain recovery. Strain means change shape, relative shape change. Recovery means, okay, initially you press it, but when you release it from the die, it goes so-called spring back, comes back a little bit. Why? Because you suddenly decreased the pressure, right? Just by elasticity, it's going to spring back somewhat. And sometimes you do not want the spring back to be too large, otherwise it's going to cause cracking. After pressure is released, the powder compact would spring back, or so-called expand slightly, and release the stored spring back. Spring, think of spring, it's so-called elastic, reversible energy. Okay. And the features, if you use higher pressure or higher organic content, you have more of this spring back effect. Make sense? Higher pressure, I put more elastic energy into the system, spring back more. Higher organic content, because organics, you think of them, they behave more like plastics or extreme case like rubber. And rubber, when you press hard, when you release, it's going to spring back a lot. Okay. And the spring back sometimes may increase the friction between the powder and the die, and may also cause damage to the sample. To help it, you can add lubricant, some greasy stuff, stearic acid, to help reduce the friction and reduce the pressure for ejection. Just to keep that in mind, sometimes sample may come back in shape. Okay. And let's talk about the defects in pressing. When you do things like pressing a pallet, it seems simple, but believe it or not, sometimes you run into all types of defects that I borrowed from this book. Delamination. You press a pallet, simple, but then when you release it, it's kind of like a multi-layered cake. Happens. Sometimes so-called capping. At the cross section, it has this sphere cap kind of delamination comes out. Or ring capping. I saw this a lot, quite often when I try to use too high pressure. I saw this when I was using too high pressure. Believe it or not, I was doing dry pressing when I was a PhD student, and I was pressing, increase the pressure, and every sample that I pressed have this ring capping effect. I'm trying to press the same palette, which is using so-called spray dried and nicely flow capability yttrium stabilized zirconia. And every sample that I got have this ring capping. And finally, I checked with the postdoctor. I did that for 2 days, literally 2 days. And then I realized, okay, he told me you are using too high pressure. And the too high pressure, what happens is the friction between the wall and causing the pressure non-uniformity. The center and the side has different pressure, and when you release the spring back, and everything would crack. Everything would crack. Believe it or not, it's just like that. Vertical crack sometimes. I don't really see this in my sample, but there are. And warping, bending. Okay, it may bend. Defects in pressing. The origins, where do all this come from? Primarily due to, read to yourself, internal or wall friction, the sample friction, and it happens more when you do not have a lubricant or when you go to too high pressure. When you go to too high pressure, you are going to fill in really all the gap between the wall and your sample. few years, and then the friction becomes high, and especially when you release it. And in the other one, in homogeneous dye filling, that's why people try to use so-called granulated spray-dried powder, so that it allows the so-called flow capability, and this, hopefully you can start with more uniform packing. But pay attention to this defect. Appears simple, but you may got stuck in there for quite some time as I was a student. So approaches to mitigate this defect. Ensure uniform filling. Simple, but just try to do it. Use powder with good flow capability. Use powder with uniform characteristics. Make sense? The other one, use sometimes organic binder. That can help to bind the stuff together. That's one. It will help increase the compact strength. And also don't forget, remember, be appropriate in your pressure. Not too high, not too low. Remember, when I was doing this, I was using, when it happens consistently, when I was using too high pressure, because by that time I go to too high pressure, the friction gets higher, and the stress distribution non-uniformity gets higher. On the other hand, do not use too low pressure, because too low pressure, you do not have a dense enough starting point for sintering. Make sense? You see the trade-off. Not too low, which you do not have a high enough relative density for packing, but not too high, because too high, believe it or not, you start to have more of this cracking. Okay? And also don't forget, sometimes you need some help from organic binder. But sometimes we try to avoid organic binder because it complicates, especially if you have large samples, it complicates the heat treatment process. You have to go very slowly, which may not be good. And use lubricant. Lubricant reduces friction between the wall and the particle and helps the pressure to be more uniform. Okay? Decrease pressure needed to reduce or avoid so-called spring back. You think of this. Too high pressure, and when you release, okay? Use small thickness to diameter ratio. That's still about uniformity, pressure uniformity. If the thickness to diameter ratio is large, if the thickness to diameter is large, you can imagine the friction effect is even larger, and inside the sample it will not be packed very densely. Make sense? You want a pallet with relatively small to thickness to diameter ratio, but you cannot go to too thin, right? Too thin, mechanically it becomes unstable. Okay. Generally less than 0.5 for single action, or smaller than 1 for double action. So your thickness to diameter generally is roughly 1 or less than 1. You do not want to do dry pressing a long cylinder. You don't really do dry pressing for a long cylinder because the friction is going to kill you. Inside, you can rest assured you don't have a lot of pressure, uniform pressure within your sample. Make sense? Yeah. But on the other hand, you cannot go to too thin, because dry pressing is not to make too thin sample. For very thin sample, you use tape casting or something like that, not by pressing.